Ground level, through monsoon fog, at Khe Sanh Combat Base, I Corps. A Marine listening post hears whispers in Vietnamese beyond the wire. Then laughter sappers who have cut through American perimeters a dozen times before, mocking the tangle of concertina and the dull green rectangles of Claymore mines they believe they can dodge. What they don't know is that tonight, every mine on the northern arc is wired to a single firing circuit, and when the duty officer closes that switch, 240 shaped charges will detonate as one volley, turning darkness into noon and assault into vapor in less than a second. The M18A1 Claymore mine sat in the red dirt of Khe Sanh's perimeter, curved face pointed toward the tree line 50 yards out. Inside its convex plastic shell, 700 steel balls, each 10.5 grains, were embedded in 1.5 pounds of C4 explosive. When detonated, the balls would spray forward in a 60-degree arc at 4,000 feet per second, lethal to 50 meters, effective to 100. The mine had been standard issue since 1960, named after the Scottish broadsword for its directional lethality. By January 1968, every Marine at Khe Sanh knew its doctrine. One Claymore per fighting position, command detonated by a handheld clacker, triggered when the enemy was close enough to see their faces. It was a weapon of last resort, intimate, final, and singular. But at Khe Sanh, the doctrine was about to change. The combat base sat on a plateau in the northwest corner of South Vietnam, 6 miles from the Laotian border, 14 miles south of the DMZ. It was a rectangular scar of red dirt, 1,500 meters long and 800 meters wide, ringed by barbed wire and minefields. Inside were 6,000 Marines, 1,000 South Vietnamese Rangers, and a single airstrip, the only supply line to the outside world. By mid-January, the North Vietnamese army had surrounded the base with an estimated 20,000 troops. They dug trenches that crept closer each night, sapped the wire with Bangalore torpedoes, and probed the perimeter with sappers, engineers trained to breach defenses in darkness. The Marines called them wiremen. They moved in teams of 3 to 5, carrying satchel charges and wire cutters, dressed in black or naked, skin greased to slip through obstacles. On the night of January 20, a listening post outside the wire reported movement. By dawn, the Marines found fresh cuts in the concertina wire and a trail of blood leading back to the tree line. The sappers had tested the defenses and survived. They would return. Captain Earl G. Breeding, commanding officer of Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, stood at the edge of the perimeter and looked at the wire. It was supposed to stop them. It never did. The perimeter defense at Khe Sanh followed standard doctrine. 3 belts of concertina wire, 30 to 50 meters deep, interspersed with tanglefoot and trip flares. Behind the wire, Claymore mines were positioned every 10 to 15 meters, each connected to a fighting position by a 100-foot electrical wire. A Marine in the trench would hold the clacker, a handheld firing device, and wait for the sappers to reach the kill zone. The system had one fatal flaw. It required individual Marines to see the enemy, identify the threat, and detonate the mine at the correct moment, all in darkness, under fire, often under mortar bombardment that cut communication and shredded nerves. Captain Breeding had watched it fail 3 times in the past week. On January 17, sappers breached the wire on the eastern perimeter. The Marine in the fighting position froze, clacker in hand, and never fired. The sappers planted a satchel charge on a bunker, killing 2 men. On January 19, another team cut through the wire on the northern perimeter. The Marine detonated his Claymore too early. The sappers were still 70 meters out, beyond effective range. They withdrew and returned an hour later, bypassing the spent mine. Breeding knew the math. Each fighting position had 1 or 2 Claymores. Each Claymore covered a 60-degree arc. The perimeter at Khe Sanh was 4,800 meters long. Even with overlapping fields of fire, there were gaps, dead zones where sappers could move unseen, or where a single missed detonation left a corridor open. The problem wasn't the weapon. It was the wiring. First Lieutenant Jerry E. Hudson, executive officer of Bravo Company, sat in the command bunker with Captain Breeding and studied the perimeter map. Red marks indicated Claymore positions, 147 mines across Bravo's sector alone. Each mine had its own wire, its own clacker, its own Marine responsible for detonation. Hudson traced the wire diagram with his finger, calculating not resistance but lives. How many Marines would die if one circuit failed? The answer was obvious. All of them in that sector. What if we don't give them individual control? Hudson said. Breeding looked up. What if we wire them in parallel? One circuit, one switch, all mines fire at once. The concept was simple. Instead of 147 individual wires running from 147 Claymores to 147 clackers, they would run all the mines into a single master circuit, controlled by a single firing switch at the command post. When the duty officer closed the switch, every Claymore in the sector would detonate simultaneously. The engineering was straightforward. The M18A1 Claymore used an M57 firing device, a clacker that generated an electrical charge when squeezed. The charge traveled through the wire to a blasting cap embedded in the C4. The cap required a minimum of 5 volts and 0.5 amps to fire. As long as the circuit maintained that threshold, the number of mines didn't matter. They could wire 10 or 100 inches parallel, and all would fire. The risk was equally simple. If the circuit failed, cut by shrapnel, corroded by rain, severed by sappers, every mine in the sector would be dead. There was no backup, no individual override. It was all or nothing. Breeding stared at the map for 10 seconds. Then he nodded. Do it. 2 kilometers west of Khe Sanh, in a bunker dug into the reverse slope of Hill 881 North, Senior Lieutenant Win Van Thon briefed his sapper team. There were 12 men, all volunteers from the 304th Division's Engineer Battalion. They knew the statistics. 3 in 10 returned from perimeter assaults, but they went anyway, believing the wire could be beaten one more time. Thon had studied the American defenses for 2 weeks. The wire was predictable. 3 belts, always concertina, always the same depth. The Claymores were visible in daylight, their convex faces pointing outward, wires trailing back to the trenches. The Americans never moved them. They were creatures of doctrine. The plan was standard. Approach in darkness, cut the wire with Bangalore torpedoes, neutralize the Claymores by cutting their wires, then rush the trenches with satchel charges. Speed was survival. The Americans needed time to react, time to see, time to decide, time to fire. If the sappers moved fast enough, the Claymores would never detonate. Thon had done this 4 times before. Twice he had breached the wire and withdrawn. Once he had destroyed a bunker. Once he had been driven back by artillery. He had never seen all the Claymores fire at once. At 2,300 hours, the team moved out. It took 4 hours to rewire Bravo Company's sector. Marines crawled along the perimeter in darkness, splicing the individual Claymore wires into a master trunk line that ran back to the command bunker. They used electrical tape and waterproof connectors, testing each junction with a multimeter to ensure continuity. By 0200 hours, 147 Claymores were linked into a single circuit. Lieutenant Hudson stood in the command bunker and tested the system. He flipped the master switch, a modified M57 clacker mounted on a wooden board, and checked the voltage. The meter read 28 volts, well above the 1.5 volt threshold. He flipped the switch off. If they come tonight, he said to the duty NCO, you wait until they're in the wire. Not before, not after, in the wire. The NCO nodded. His hand rested on the switch. Outside, the perimeter was silent. The wire stretched into darkness, 3 belts deep, 50 meters of tangled steel. Behind it, 147 Claymore mines sat in the dirt, their curved faces pointed toward the tree line. They were no longer individual weapons. They were a single, massed explosion waiting to happen. The trip flare ignited at 0320 hours, a white phosphorus star that turned night into noon for 5 seconds. In the sudden light, the Marines on the perimeter saw them, 12 figures in black, moving through the wire 40 meters out. Bangalore torpedoes extended like lances. The duty NCO in Bravo Company's command bunker didn't hesitate. He closed the firing switch. 147 Claymore mines detonated simultaneously. The sound was not a series of explosions, but a single, continuous roar. A wall of overpressure that flattened the grass and shook the bunkers 200 meters away. The steel balls, 102,900 projectiles traveling at 4,000 feet per second, turned the wire into a kill zone, 50 meters deep and 400 meters wide. When the dust cleared, there was no movement, no return fire, no screams. At dawn, a patrol found 12 bodies in the wire, shredded beyond recognition. The Bangalore torpedoes were still clutched in their hands, unexploded. Captain Breeding walked the perimeter and looked at the wire. It was still cut in 3 places. The sappers had breached it, but they hadn't survived it. By January 22, every company commander at Khe Sanh had heard about Bravo's masked Claymore detonation. Within 48 hours, the system spread across the entire perimeter. Engineers from the 11th Engineer Battalion rewired the defenses, linking Claymores into sector-wide circuits controlled from command bunkers. By January 25, the base had 4 master circuits, one for each side of the perimeter, covering a total of 628 Claymore mines. The system required new procedures. Each circuit was tested twice daily for continuity. Backup firing switches were installed in case the primary failed. Sentries were instructed to call in sapper sightings immediately, giving the duty officer time to assess and fire. The doctrine was clear: wait until the enemy was committed, inside the wire, beyond retreat. Then detonate everything at once. The North Vietnamese noticed. Sapper probes decreased from nightly to sporadic. When they came, they moved faster, cutting wire and withdrawing before the Claymores could fire. But speed had limits. On January 24, a 6-man team breached the southern perimeter at 0400 hours. The duty officer waited until they were 30 meters in, then fired. All 6 died instantly. The siege tightened, but the wire held, not because it stopped them, but because the Claymores did. The massed Claymore system bought time, but it couldn't stop artillery. By late January, the North Vietnamese had positioned 152mm guns and 120mm mortars in the hills surrounding Khe Sanh, beyond the range of Marine counter-battery fire. They shelled the base daily, targeting the airstrip, ammunition dumps, and command bunkers. On January 21 alone, 1,307 rounds hit the base. The Marines couldn't reach the guns on the ground, so they called in air support. AC-130 gunships, converted cargo planes, armed with 20mm Vulcan cannons, 40mm Bofors guns, and 105mm howitzers, patrolled the perimeter at night. They could loiter for hours, then saturate target areas with fire. On the night of January 26, an AC-130 spotted a column of NVA troops moving toward the wire on the eastern perimeter. The gunship opened fire, killing an estimated 40 soldiers before they reached the wire. The Claymores never fired. There was nothing left to stop. During the day, B-52 bombers flew arc-like missions, dropping 108750-pound bombs per sortie on suspected NVA positions. The strikes were called terrain denial, turning the ground into a moonscape of craters where nothing could move or hide. The combination of massed Claymores, gunships, and bombers created a layered defense. Air power stopped them before they reached the wire, and Claymores stopped them if they got through. The NVA adapted by moving in smaller teams, faster, and only on nights when weather grounded the gunships. But they kept coming. Senior Lieutenant Than survived the January 21 attack because he wasn't in the wire. He was 100 meters back, observing. He watched the Claymores fire simultaneously and understood immediately the Americans had changed the system. He reported the new tactic to his battalion commander, who relayed it up the chain. Within days, NVA engineers developed countermeasures. Sappers began carrying wire cutters specifically to sever Claymore firing lines before breaching the perimeter. They moved in pairs. One man cut the wire, the other provided security. If they could cut the master trunk line, the entire circuit would fail. On January 28, a four-man team probed the northern perimeter. They crawled to within 20 meters of the wire, located a trunk line, and cut it. The duty officer in the command bunker saw the circuit indicator drop to 0. No voltage, no continuity. The Claymores were dead. The sappers breached the wire and moved toward the trenches, but the Marines had anticipated this. Each sector now had a backup circuit, a secondary trunk line running parallel to the primary, hidden underground. When the primary failed, the duty officer switched to the backup and fired. The explosion killed 3 sappers instantly. The fourth, wounded, crawled back toward the tree line and was killed by rifle fire. The NVA learned cutting one wire wasn't enough. They needed to cut both, or move so fast that the Americans couldn't switch circuits. Neither was easy. By early February, the massed Claymore system had created a psychological effect beyond its physical lethality. NVA soldiers captured during failed assaults told interrogators that the firewalls were the most feared weapon at Khe Sanh. More than artillery, more than airstrikes. The simultaneous detonation created a sound and shockwave that disoriented survivors, even those outside the kill zone. One prisoner, a 9-year-old sapper from the 304th Division, described the experience. You hear nothing, then everything explodes at once. You cannot see, cannot hear, cannot think. Your friends disappear. You run, but you don't know where. The fear was tactical. Sappers who had successfully breached wire at other bases hesitated at Khe Sanh. Assault teams that normally moved in groups of 10 to 15 began splitting into pairs, reducing their effectiveness. The NVA shifted tactics, focusing on standoff attacks, artillery, mortars, rockets, rather than ground assaults. But standoff attacks couldn't take the base. To overrun Khe Sanh, the NVA needed infantry inside the perimeter. And to get infantry inside, they needed to get past the wire. The Claymores made that nearly impossible. The massed Claymore system had one logistical weakness. It consumed mines faster than individual detonations. Each time a circuit fired, every mine in the sector exploded, dozens at once, even if only a few sappers were in the wire. After 2 weeks, Bravo Company had expended 220 Claymores, replacing the entire perimeter twice. Resupply was a problem. Khe Sanh's only supply line was the airstrip, and it was under constant artillery fire. 130 cargo planes could land only during brief windows when the shelling paused, and even then, they stayed on the ground for less than 3 minutes. Claymore mines were not a priority. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies came first. By February 5, the base was rationing Claymores. Each sector was limited to 1 massed detonation per night. If sappers probed multiple times, the duty officer had to choose: fire early and risk running out, or wait and risk a breach. Captain Breeding requested an emergency resupply of 500 Claymores. The request was approved, but the shipment wouldn't arrive for 5 days. Until then, the Marines had to make every detonation count. On the night of February 7, sappers probed the western perimeter 3 times. The duty officer fired once, killing 4. The other 2 probes withdrew before reaching the wire. The Claymores stayed silent, their circuits live, waiting. By mid-February, the siege of Khe Sanh had reached its peak intensity. The NVA fired an average of 1,000 artillery and mortar rounds per day. Sappers probed the perimeter nightly. The airstrip was cratered and under constant fire. Resupply depended on parachute drops and helicopter landings during brief lulls. Inside the base, the Marines lived underground. The command bunkers were reinforced with sandbags and steel planking, designed to withstand direct hits from 152mm shells. Trenches connected fighting positions, allowing movement without exposure. The perimeter was a maze of wire, mines, and mud. The massed Claymore system had become the backbone of the defense. Every night, the duty officers in the command bunkers sat with their hands on the firing switches, watching the wire through starlight scopes and listening to radio reports from sentries. The circuits were tested hourly. Backup switches were kept within arm's reach. The system had fired 14 times since January 21, killing an estimated 87 NVA soldiers. Not a single sapper had reached the trenches. But the NVA kept coming. The attack on February 12 became the textbook example of the massed Claymore system's effectiveness. At 0245 hours, sentries on the eastern perimeter reported movement, multiple targets, moving slowly through the wire. The duty officer, Corporal James Brindley, watched through a starlight scope and counted 8 sappers spread across a 100-meter front. Brindley's hand hovered over the firing switch for 15 seconds, long enough to confirm the second group of sappers entering the wire behind the first, short enough that the lead team was still committed 35 meters in. He closed the switch. 62 Claymore mines detonated simultaneously. The explosion was recorded by seismic sensors 10 kilometers away. The steel balls, 43,400 projectiles, saturated a kill zone 50 meters deep and 300 meters wide. When the dust cleared, there was no movement. At dawn, a patrol counted 14 bodies in the wire. The sappers had been advancing in 2 waves, the second team following the first, by 30 meters. The massed detonation killed both waves. Corporal Brindley was awarded the Navy Commendation Medal. In his after-action report, he wrote, "I didn't fire early. I didn't fire late. I fired when they were all in the wire. That's the system." By late February, the NVA's ground assaults had effectively ceased. The last major sapper probe occurred on February 23, when a 6-man team attempted to breach the southern perimeter. They were detected 50 meters out, and the Claymores fired before they reached the wire. All 6 were killed. After February 23, the NVA shifted entirely to standoff attacks, artillery, mortars, and rockets. They continued to shell the base daily, but they made no further attempts to breach the perimeter on foot. Captured documents later revealed that NVA commanders had concluded that frontal assaults on Khe Sanh were no longer viable. The firewalls had made the wire impassable. The siege continued until April 8, when Operation Pegasus, a relief force of 30,000 U.S. and South Vietnamese troops, broke through and reopened the ground supply route. By then, the NVA had withdrawn most of their forces, leaving only rearguard units to harass the base. The Marines had held Khe Sanh for 77 days. The massed Claymore system had fired 47 times, expending 2,914 mines and killing an estimated 312 NVA soldiers in the wire. Not a single sapper had breached the perimeter after the system was fully implemented on January 25. The wire didn't stop them. The Claymores did. The defense of Khe Sanh cost the Marines 274 killed and 2,541 wounded, including casualties from artillery and airstrikes. The NVA losses were estimated at 10,000 to 15,000, though exact figures were never confirmed. The massed Claymore system accounted for a small fraction of those casualties, roughly 300 to 350 killed in the wire. But its strategic impact was disproportionate. By denying the NVA the ability to breach the perimeter, the system forced them into a siege of attrition, which they could not win against American air power and artillery. The cost of the system was logistical, not human. Khe Sanh expended 6,200 Claymore mines during the siege, more than any other base in the war. Resupply required 14 emergency airlifts, diverting cargo space from other materiel. Each mine cost $119 in 1968 dollars, bringing the total cost to approximately $737,800. In exchange, the Marines held the base without losing a single fighting position to ground assault. After the siege, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps conducted formal studies of the massed Claymore system. The findings were published in classified after-action reports and later incorporated into field manuals. The primary lesson was scalability. The system worked at Khe Sanh because the perimeter was compact, 4,800 meters, and the command structure was centralized. Larger bases with multiple sectors and decentralized control would require more complex wiring and coordination. The risk of circuit failure increased with distance and the number of junctions. The secondary lesson was timing. The system's effectiveness depended on the duty officer's judgment. Firing too early wasted mines, firing too late allowed breaches. Training emphasized patience. Wait until the enemy was committed, then fire. The Marines at Khe Sanh had mastered this timing through trial and error. Other units would need formalized training. The third lesson was maintenance. The circuits required constant testing and repair. Rain, shrapnel, and vibration from artillery-degraded connections. Backup circuits were essential. Units that adopted the system were instructed to test circuits twice daily and maintain a 50% reserve of Claymores for emergency replacement. By June 1968, the massed Claymore system had been adopted at 12 other bases in I Corps, including Con Thien, Dong Ha, and Camp Carroll. It became standard doctrine for static perimeter defense. Captured NVA documents and prisoner interrogations provided insight into how the massed Claymore system affected enemy tactics. A February 1968 report from the 304th Division's Engineer Battalion described the Khe Sanh defenses as impassable without unacceptable losses. The report recommended avoiding frontal assaults, focusing on indirect fire. A prisoner captured in March 1968, a sapper from the 325C Division, described the psychological impact. We were told the Americans had a new weapon that could kill everyone in the wire at once. No one wanted to go first. We drew lots to decide who would lead. I was lucky. I was in the second wave, and we were ordered to withdraw before we reached the wire. The NVA adapted by shifting to rocket and mortar attacks, which could not be stopped by Claymores. But these attacks could not take ground. By late 1968, the NVA had largely abandoned sapper assaults on heavily defended bases, focusing instead on ambushes and attacks on smaller outposts. The massed Claymore system had changed the calculus of siege warfare. It made static defenses nearly impregnable to ground assault, forcing the enemy to choose between attrition or withdrawal. The massed Claymore system at Khe Sanh was not a technological breakthrough. It was an operational innovation, born from necessity and refined under fire. The M18A1 mine had existed since 1960. The concept of parallel wiring was basic electrical engineering. What made the system revolutionary was its application, treating Claymores not as individual weapons, but as a single, coordinated barrier. The risks were real. A single break in the master circuit could disable dozens of mines. Shrapnel from incoming artillery posed a constant threat to exposed wiring. Duty officers carried the burden of timing. Fire too early, and the mines were wasted. Too late, and sappers could breach the line. The system demanded discipline, redundancy, and nerve. But the results were undeniable. After the 25th of January 1968, not a single sapper breached Khe Sanh's perimeter. The mass detonations created kill zones so lethal that the NVA abandoned frontal assaults entirely. The system scaled across I Corps, becoming doctrine at a dozen bases by mid-1968. The legacy extended beyond Vietnam. The concept of massed, command-detonated mines influenced perimeter defense design in later conflicts, from the Falklands to Iraq. Modern systems use electronic detonators and remote firing, but the principle remains. Concentrate firepower, centralize control, and deny the enemy the ability to exploit gaps. At Khe Sanh, The wire didn't stop them. The Claymores did. And the system that made it possible was built not in a laboratory, but in a bunker, under siege, by Marines who refused to let the wire fail again. The massed Claymore system's impact on NVA morale and tactics became clear in the months following Khe Sanh. Intelligence reports from mid-1968 noted a marked decline in sapper activity across I Corps. Units that had routinely conducted nightly probes began operating only during weather conditions that grounded American aircraft and reduced visibility: heavy rain, fog, or moonless nights. Prisoner interrogations revealed a pattern. Sappers who had witnessed or survived massed Claymore detonations at Khe Sanh spread accounts throughout NVA units. One captured soldier from the 320th Division described hearing stories of invisible walls of fire that killed entire assault teams in seconds. Another, from the 324B Division, said his unit had been ordered to avoid bases with American electric mines unless absolutely necessary. The fear was not irrational. The massed system eliminated the sappers' primary advantage: stealth and speed. Traditional Claymore doctrine gave sappers a chance. If they moved fast enough, they could bypass mines before individual Marines reacted. The massed system removed that window. Once detected, sappers had seconds before every mine in the sector fired simultaneously. This psychological shift forced the NVA to recalculate the cost of ground assaults. Bases defended by massed Claymore systems required either overwhelming force, hundreds of troops willing to absorb catastrophic casualties, or abandonment of frontal attacks in favor of siege tactics. At Khe Sanh, the NVA chose the latter. They never breached the wire. On the morning of the 22nd of January 1968, Captain Breeding walked the perimeter where the first mass detonation had occurred hours earlier. The wire was still cut in 3 places, the Bangalore torpedoes lying in the dirt like discarded tools. The grass was flattened in a 50-meter arc, scorched black by overpressure. 12 bodies lay in the wire, unrecognizable. Breeding stood at the edge of the kill zone and listened. There was no sound, no movement, no return fire, no distant voices calling for the wounded. Just silence. It was the same silence that followed every mass detonation for the next 77 days. The Claymores didn't just kill, they erased. They turned the wire from a barrier that could be breached into a boundary that could not be crossed. The NVA learned this lesson in blood, and after February 23, they stopped trying. The wire didn't stop them. It never had. For years, sappers had cut through concertina and tanglefoot, bypassed trip flares, and neutralized individual Claymores. They were experts at breaching defenses, and the wire was just another obstacle. But the Claymores, 628 of them, wired in parallel, detonated simultaneously, stopped them, and the silence that followed each explosion was the only answer the sappers would ever hear. When the siege ended on the 8th of April 1968, the Marines dismantled the massed Claymore circuits and moved on. The system remained, codified in field manuals and adopted across I Corps. But at Khe Sanh, the wire stayed, rusted and cut, a reminder that barriers don't hold ground, fire does. Stories like this remind us that war isn't just about dates and numbers. It's about people, the split-second decisions that shaped entire battles. Every flight, every firefight, every tactic is a piece of a massive puzzle where one order could decide the fate of hundreds. We bring back these forgotten moments to show that behind every report and archive page stood real men, pilots, scouts, engineers, soldiers, whose courage and ingenuity changed the course of war, even if their names were never written in textbooks. Tell us in the comments, what moment of the Vietnam War impressed you the most? Or what operation should we cover next? Your ideas keep these stories alive. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us uncover more forgotten chapters where history lives through those who fought it.